Hi everyone. As Michael said, my name's Tom, and really there are two ways to look at this talk. Either I'm doing the graveyard shift, or they saved the best till last. I'll let you decide when I'm done speaking. But today I'm going to talk to you about some of the new capabilities that we have been working on here at causaLens. So at causaLens, we're obsessed with our mission, which is to help organizations advance their decision making. We believe that organizations today face greater uncertainty, higher velocity, and lower margin for error in the decisions that they're making. But despite these headwinds, there are a number of different tailwinds, such as the growing adoption of analytics and AI tools, as we've kind of touched on the trend quite a few talks and quite a few conversations about generative AI, but also the adoption of data. And so really what we see as one of the key defining competitive advantages over the next sort of few years and decades is the ability for organizations to move from data to decisions. And those that can do this with the greatest efficacy are going to be the ones that succeed. However, navigating this is very, very tricky. And there are a number of different challenges that we hope to tackle when we talk about decisionOps. The first is that the majority of analytics and predictive and correlational machine learning techniques today provide you with an understanding of what will happen next, but don't tell you how to act in order to change that outcome or ensure that outcome. This means that you end up with inactionable outputs from all of the work that you're doing. You're not actually answering the business and enterprise questions that you care about. The second piece of this is there's a translation problem. When data scientists report their results to the business, they report them in terms of precision, recall, accuracy. These don't translate. What business leaders care about are ROI, cost savings, revenue generation. We believe that decisionOps can help tackle these two problems and offer a path through this maze. So when we think about data decisions, there are kind of three pillars that we build that on here at causaLens. The first, and I've touched on this briefly, is recommendations. We think that in order to succeed, you need systems that output actionable recommendations that inform you how to act in the environment that you're working within. We see this, and kind of the way that we contrast this internally between sort of predictive outputs and those from Causal AI, is taking a sporting analogy. If you're a fan of a given sports team, then predictive analytics is perfect because it can tell you how to make the bet in order to maximize your return. It can tell you the most likely outcome of the game you're watching, and so you can get a nice fat payout. But if you're the manager of that sports team, if you're the person wanting to change the outcome of that prediction, you need to understand how to intervene. And so it's a passive versus an active mindset. And if you're working within that organization, if you're running that business, if you're the manager of the team, you really need these actionable recommendations in order to be effective. The second part of this is actually putting those recommendations into action. So much of the time we've seen machine learning projects fail because they don't get out of the laboratory. One of the key capabilities that we believe is fundamental to actually making these decisions is getting them into the real world. And so we'll talk a little bit about the different integrations and how we think about acting on those in order to do that. And then the final ingredient we have is traction. So we want to understand whether or not our decisions are being effective. We want to understand how we've moved from action to outcome and realized any sort of value and ROI from that. But crucially, we want to understand that traction in terms of the KPIs that we care about, in terms of those ROI numbers, that customer lifetime value. And so we see decisionOps as a cyclical piece that helps us move through this recommendation, action, traction loop, allowing us to go from recommendation into an action to attract outcome and measure the performance and attribute that using Causal AI. So let's touch on each of these three pillars in a little bit more detail. The first one we're going to look at is recommendation. And fundamentally, and you'll see on the board out there for those in the room, we believe that your enterprise and your organization already runs on causal questions. And you need to make use of Causal AI and the associated techniques in order to be able to answer those. We believe that going beyond predictions is the only feasible way of effectively doing this. So let's zoom in on a given example. Let's take a look at customer retention. So what can I do to actually prevent churn in my organization? Let's say now that I'm a churn analyst and I want to understand the actions that I can take to prevent that. Using decisionOps or using the causaLens technology, we can actually create an application that generates these recommendations. And so we can see here that right at the top, we've got all of the KPIs that I care about as a churn analyst. I can immediately filter for those at risk of churning. And I'm now moving beyond the predictive and correlational analytics by running recourse. I can actually understand the interventions that I want to take in order to prevent these individuals from churning. I can view these results. I can see here that for this first person, I can actually offer them a 17.5% discount, and that will mean that they no longer actually want to leave the organization, or is estimated to not to leave. I can submit this action to a downstream system and also log it with decisionOps. So this is just one way of orchestrating this technology, and we can see here the workflow that's just taken place. I've taken data, moved it into a causal model, and generated an actionable recommendation that I've then captured in a downstream system and fed into decisionOps. The final piece is to actually capture that as a given outcome. And so in a KPI that I care about, we can actually capture that traction. So how is this working under the covers? How do we actually kind of perform these actions? Well, really it's about orchestration, and that's fundamentally the key word for decisionOps. So we've actually defined an action trigger, and this can just be any sort of arbitrary Python logic. We hope to work with customers in the future to actually define these in a much more structured way. But we can then register that to our decision workflow and actually call that trigger on demand. We can then deploy that decision workflow within that application. So that application we saw from our churn analyst before really is just calling that Salesforce trigger whenever someone clicks submit. This makes it a very flexible system, and it means that many different workflow orchestrators can actually be used to call these workflows. And then the final piece is to actually set up that outcome tracker. So again, we define sort of the logic that we would like to perform, and then we schedule that on a case-by-case basis to scrape that downstream system and actually understand whether the action we've taken has converted to a reasonable outcome. So if we return to that workflow we saw before, what we can see is that currently we're working in this decision app sort of environment, but we can rapidly, thanks to the flexibility of the underlying toolkit, roll this into a workflow automation. So we've connected into different enterprise systems, and we could be using Zapier, Make, or NAN to actually be orchestrating these. In a manufacturing example, we might want to use robotic process automation tools like Blue Prism or UiPath in order to actually perform that orchestration. These are just writing data back to the decisionOps system that we'll look at in a second. And so just touching on how we actually measure that traction. The key part is that we're actually intervening to change outcomes here. We're acting in the real world to change the outcomes we want to. So we might be giving a certain cohort of people a discount. We're then going to estimate the counterfactual and actually understand what the difference would have been to our KPIs had we not performed that action. This then ultimately helps us to calculate our decision-making performance. And so we can report back to our business, in terms of the KPIs they care about, how our decision-making performance is going. So let's now move to the decisionOps sort of management pane. We're now in the shoes of the VP of Customer Success. They've got a range of different KPIs that they want to kind of optimize and track. And so we can see this all live within this dashboard. If we zoom in first into this customer churn example, we can see along the bottom our decision history, all of the previous decisions that we've made within that application we saw earlier, aggregated and rolled up to an overall view. And then this graph helps us to understand what our decision-making performance is in reality, which is that blocked line, and then the estimates, which are the dotted line into the future. We can also zoom into an individual decision. We can say, what was the performance of this specific action that my analyst took? We can see the KPI impact that that had and the attribution of that. We can see the cost associated with that example. And we can also see whether the kind of status of that outcome. And so that's the sort of foundational framework that we've built thus far with decisionOps. There's a long way to go, but where we see this vision going ultimately is scale. So if we think of an organization that has a marketing attribution case, it's very, very likely that the graph and the causal model that they've developed around that they're optimizing using recommendation, action, and traction, is going to feed into their understanding of customer retention, which is the kind of use case we've been looking at throughout today. So there's some sort of causal link and shared subgraph between these two use cases. Now, on the other side of the business, they might be performing manufacturing root cause analysis to understand and help maximize the efficacy of their production lines. This, in turn, could form into supply chain optimization, and you can start to see how all these different use cases kind of connect with one another. Now, both sides of the business could be connected in a pricing and promotion sort of setting. You know, what discounts and promotions should I offer, given I have an excess in my supply chain? And this will then, in turn, impact who I retain as a customer. But fundamentally, what we're building up to is the ability to perform these kind of recommendation, action, and traction actions across your enterprise performance in order to maximize and optimize across a range of different use cases. So as you build up these different causal kind of algorithms and use cases, you can begin to feed into this hierarchical and higher level understanding of how your business is performing. So just to conclude, decisionOps helps to accelerate your journey from data to decisions. It helps you to move around this recommendation, action, and traction loop. We're in early access now, and so if this kind of talk has piqued your interest, if there are any other sort of avenues you want to explore, please do get in touch. We're looking for partners to help develop this out and work with you in kind of furthering our vision for this. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much for that. It's an interesting vision for the future there. So I'm sure that some people have some questions about that vision right there. So anybody want to ask Tom anything?
Please.
We have some bold people in the front row here.
Thank you. Oh, just a curiosity about the recommendation step.
Yeah.
Do you actually learn the best treatment, for example? Like you learn to recommend, or you just learn the effect and then you base the decision on the effect?
So in the specific example that we saw today, it's using effectively a technique called algorithmic recourse. So we're using our causal model to actually understand the interventions that would be required to push a person over a given decision boundary. In this case, whether they're going to churn or not. And so we're basically performing an optimization over the intervention space to say, these are the interventions that we believe are most likely to result in the outcome that you have.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
And then...
When you provide the recommendations, through the dashboards and whatever metrics, how often basically is the estimation part separated from the post estimation, from the recommendation part? Like how many times the model is trained as opposed to instead tested, let's say in the post estimation part? Like, is it trained every time, or how often can be set to be trained versus just the post estimation part, the actual recommendations delivery?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. What we found, I think, is that it's very use case dependent. So usually it's driven by the frequency at which the business needs to use that algorithm. So we found that if it's a weekly cadence, then they will want that model when it's needed on that weekly cadence to have been retrained and updated with that data from the previous week as well. If it's more of a real-time basis, obviously that becomes more difficult. We have a number of tools that help you to understand the correctness of fit of that algorithm, and therefore flag when you should retrain. But generally, it's driven sort of by the business need. Does that answer the question?
During the action step, can you randomize people to a different action so that you can more validly estimate the counterfactual-factual difference?
Yeah, so that's not something that we've built into the capabilities as it stands, but that's definitely an area that we've considered and we've looked at expanding out to. I think the randomization impact would have a really strong effect on understanding, getting the true treatment effect and that sort of side of things. So that is something we want to develop in the future. It's not something in the capabilities today.
Thanks. So this is going to be a two-part question. So first is on the recommendation side. Is the current, roadmap, were you able to build additional constraints? Because what you recommend may not be what's feasible or viable for the business to take.
Yeah, so within the recommendation engines that we have today, you can build in those constraints. So you can build in costs, you can build in relative costs of whether one intervention is more expensive to perform in reality than another. And you can also say, what are your actionable variables? So, if you have age as a feature within your data set, obviously you can't intervene to change that. So you can actually add that as an inactionable variable.
Cool, thanks. Second part for the action part. I guess the way you can actually track, because of the insights recommendation level, is aligned with the same granularity for the workflow, right? For the people actually taking action. For a lot of the decision making, I think some of the MMM model, right? They're taking at a very strategic level. How do you track those value? Because those may not be directly translating to something like marketing action that you can actually easily track because you can connect to another API. Like, any thoughts on that? Like more hierarchy, like decision?
Yeah, so there are definitely some decision processes that lend themselves more readily to the attribution that we've described today. I agree that we've kind of gone through quite a straightforward sort of use case. Where we see those more complex interactions occurring, effectively there'll be a combination of your causal graph and your decision model of the world, how you actually enforce those decisions in kind of further down the line, and bringing those two together so that you can understand when the outcome of your causal model is produced, or your recommendation, what the process is to actually realize that in the real world. And once you understand that, you can actually sort of begin to kind of attribute the level of confidence that you would assign to the outcome that you see down the line. But fundamentally, what we would kind of ultimately rely on is the correctness of your causal model. So if your causal model, your causal graph is estimating effects and understands the world very well, then the attribution of that effect should be strongly realized in the real world.
Thanks.
I have a general question. The causal AI helps us basically to make kind of data-informed decision. It helps us, to intervene. So my question is, do you think the leadership, let's say in any organization or company, they will resist the adoption of causal AI? So they will fear that it will replace them? Just in a general question, because basically what a leader in a company or organization does, so they get paid for their decision-making intervention skills. That's it. So if that's what they do, and if causal AI can actually help to replace them, do you think they will resist the adoption of the causal AI?
So I think that if you it's kind of heavily dependent on how you frame the challenge that you're supporting. What we've seen is that it's very unlikely that causal AI fundamentally isn't an automation technology. We're not looking to push, sort of take tasks off people. We're looking to enhance their productivity and enable them to be more effective in the current roles that they do. So it's not necessarily a challenge that I think we've seen a huge amount. It's more of an additive capability that we're providing to these organizations rather than kind of removing tasks from people.
Hi, I have a problem in the marketing attribution domain. So usually there are kind of existing the lagging factor, meaning we spend like $1 in brand, there will be couple months that result into final sales. Which kind of affect the causal mechanism there. I was wondering how the decisionOS or causal AI here can handle or learn the lagging factor in that mechanism, because that can be like a dynamic. For example, a brand commercial probably have a longer pack impact, influencing the following months the final sales, while some kind of a division or more campaign kind of a advertisement may impact a shorter term period. So that can be also a factor to learn in the model.
Yeah, so I think the causal platform that we have has very strong time series capabilities, and so we can support effectively modeling of those time series or those time effects across different timestamps, and building a causal model across those different timestamps whereby you can account for those lagging effects. You can actually add decays, you can add different weights to account for the different sort of impact of effects over time. So that's absolutely something that we can account for within the platform by building these time series causal graphs.
All right. If there aren't any more questions, let's do one more round of applause for Tom and thank him for his presentation.